Hello, I'm Jay, and welcome to the Relicsmith channel. In this next series of videos, we're talking about gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and the Magi and Jesus' birth. But before we can answer why the Magi brought these gifts to Jesus, or what they symbolize, we first must answer, when was Jesus born? This single question determines when the Magi could have arrived, which astronomical events the Magi saw when they say they saw his star, how old was Jesus when these gifts were presented to him, and whether December 25th has any actual chronological significance. So today I'm doing a deep dive to figure out the birth year of Jesus, and it might not be something that you think. Now when I say that, the first thing you're probably thinking is, why doesn't our calendar reflect the real birth year? If we're in 2025, doesn't that mean we're 2025 years after Jesus' birth? Well, our calendar was put together by a monk by the name of Dionysius Exiguus around 500 years after Christ was born. Now he made two foundational errors. He miscalculated the Roman emperor timelines by several years, and he created no year zero. Our system goes from 1 BC right to 1 AD. So because of this, Jesus was not born in 1 AD. The entire system is 2 to 7 years off, depending on how you count. This is universally accepted by all historians and all Christian scholars. Thus, Jesus could have been born between 7 BC and 1 BC. But which one of those years makes the most sense? By the end of this video, you're going to have a really good idea, and I'm going to present one of those years and show you why it lines up with several events and the scriptures, and to me makes the most sense. So we're going to first start with Herod, King Herod. That's the non-negotiable anchor point for when Jesus was born. In Matthew chapter 2 verse 1, it says, Jesus was born in the days of Herod the king. And immediately after the Magi visit, Herod orders the massacre of boys aged 2 and under, as said in Matthew 2:16. So this means Jesus was born before Herod died. The Magi visited when Jesus was a paidein. That's the word that Matthew uses to describe Jesus' age. The Greek paidein means young child, not infant. Luke uses the word for infant, but Matthew does not. So this points to events in Matthew. He's talking about when Christ was a little bit older, and that's when the Magi came and visited him. And then shortly after that, Mary and Joseph and Jesus flee to Egypt to avoid Herod's extermination order. So that means they had to flee before Herod's death, and then they only returned after Herod had died. So therefore, Herod's death and the year he died is the pivot to the entire chronology. Now there's two theories that exist. Traditional scholarly model says Herod died in 4 BC. Now this model is built entirely on Josephus' mention of a lunar eclipse shortly before Herod's death. And the eclipse used in that model is based on an eclipse in March 13th of 4 BC. Now that eclipse was barely visible, and it was partial, and it's extremely weak. Now the problem with this, a very weak eclipse would hardly be notable. And then there's some events that Josephus, he mentioned several things taking place between the eclipse and a Passover about the time that Herod dies. And a March 13th eclipse gives very little time for some of those events to be fulfilled. It's a very short window. So that's the majority consensus of when Herod died, in about 4 BC, putting Christ's birth at about 6 or 5 BC. Now there's also a revised model that Herod died in 1 BC. And this model is starting to gain traction and is far stronger and actually lines up with things much better. Now the evidence that Herod died in 1 BC, there is a major widely visible eclipse that occurred 1 BC. Unlike the faint 4 BC eclipse, this was a total eclipse and it was visible all across Judea. And it wasn't super close to Passover like the 4 BC eclipse, but was several months earlier. So this allows that few months of time for the events that Josephus outlines that took place right before Herod's death. and not squeezing them into a much smaller time frame. Now, to let you know what I'm talking about, Josephus records many events between the eclipse and Passover. Herod burns rabbis alive, Herod summons elders, a political trial, slow decline, attempted suicide, execution of Antipater, royal funeral, 30-day mourning, political transitions. Also, early Christian writers assume later dates. Their chronologies naturally align with a 3 BC birth, and thus fitting 1 BC year for the death of Herod. Now, I'll get into this in another video about the astronomy that lines up beautifully with a 3 or 2 BC birthday of Jesus, and thus a 1 BC death year of Herod. And that answers the possible question, what could the Magi have seen when they refer to they saw his star? So given all that, just to sum it up, there's the widely accepted 4 BC death day of Herod, which would naturally put Christ's birthday around 6 or 5 BC. Or there's the new growing model that Herod died in 1 BC, putting Christ's birthday about 3 or 2 BC. Now I'm going to go into a little bit further analysis that shows how a 3 BC birth year actually lines up with multiple things. It lines up with the supposed crucifixion date. It lines up with astronomical events that are very symbolic. It actually lines up with what the Gospels say, whereas some scholars say they contradict each other, but a 3 BC date actually solves some problems and shows cohesion between the two, and some other things. Now, I'm not taking you on some wild goose chase here, because if we establish the most likely birthday of Jesus, that gives us a better idea of what the Magi saw and a better understanding of why they may have presented these gifts and a whole lot of other things. Trust me, when I first was researching this video, I was just looking at the symbolism of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then that led me down a rabbit hole of, okay, so who were the Magi? And then that led me to, okay, then what were they seeing? And then that led me to, okay, if these events take place here, when was Christ actually born? And then that led me to something very cool that I discovered that lines up with some astronomical events and adds a deep, rich symbolism to Christmas Day itself. And trust me, we'll get all into that. And I can't wait to tell you. I've been very excited about making this series of videos to share with you what I discovered and how things line up, and trying to do a very thorough job on the research. So both dates are possible, but if Herod died in 1 BC and therefore Christ was born in around 3 or 2 BC, this fits scripture, astronomy, early Christian writings, and logic. If Herod died in 4 BC, it only fits tradition and a weak eclipse, although it's the widely accepted birth. Although there's growing evidence that Herod died in 1 BC, thus anchoring Christ's birth in about 3 or 2 BC by that model. So, just a few things when we're looking at the book of Matthew and Matthew's timeline. Jesus is born under Herod. The Magi arrive when Jesus is a young child, not an infant. The Greek term that Matthew uses, paidion, which means toddler or small child, not the word that Luke uses, brephos, meaning newborn. Herod asks when the star first appeared when the Magi visit him. Matthew 2:7, Herod inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared, because Herod was calculating the age of the child. Then Herod kills boys 2 and under, according to the time calculated from the Magi, meaning Jesus could be up to 2 years old by that time when the Magi visit him. So almost certainly the Magi arrived a year or more after Jesus' birth. So this means the Magi are not at the manger. In fact, in the book of Matthew, it says that they came to his house in Bethlehem. So by this time, they would have moved out of the manger and either renting or have a house by this time when Jesus was a young child. This also means the star that we're guiding the Magi when they come to visit Jesus, there would have been a star guiding them a little bit after his birth. Now looking at Luke's timeline, some scholars say that Luke contradicts Matthew, but when carefully examined, it does not contradict anything. Luke anchors the birth to a Roman taxation program. Luke 2:1-3, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governing Syria. Now this poses the famous problem. Luke is very specific, but it does require an examination of the original Greek, and I'll explain that. Luke says that this was a taxing when Quirinius was governing Syria, by the simple reading of it. Quirinius conducted a well-known census in 6 AD. Now that's way far off our timeline of Christ's birth, whether you accept the 6 or 5 BC or the 2 or 3 BC. I mean, by this time, Christ would be nearing a teenager, and Herod was dead by then. So Luke must have been referring to an earlier taxation. Also, Luke says that Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem during this tax, and that Herod is king during these events. So what is happening? So scholars incorrectly assume that Luke is referring to the 6 AD census. Now when I say census, I also mean taxation or registration. In the original Greek, it doesn't say taxation, it says something more along the lines of registration. So just grouping that all together, just so you know. Like I said, scholars incorrectly assume Luke is referring to the 6 AD consensus, and then just assume that he got something wrong with associating that with Jesus' birth. Now this is a historical misunderstanding, not a textual contradiction. Why? Because Quirinius was associated with multiple administrative actions in Syria before he became governor, during his military assignments, and the Greek grammar allows the translation to be read, this consensus was before Quirinius governed Syria. The Greek word prote means first, but also means prior, and many Greek scholars accept this. Now, some further reasons why the 6 AD consensus could not be the one that Luke's referring to. It was conducted after Judea became a Roman province, was a property census, and did not require returning to ancestral towns. It wasn't during the time of Herod, and this consensus happened 10 years too late, and it did not match Luke's description. So therefore it's factually impossible that Luke meant the 6 AD consensus. So when we look at Luke correctly and what he's describing, he must be referring to an earlier consensus before Quirinius was governor of Syria. And there's plenty of things that point to some of these earlier consensuses or taxations or registrations. He says all of the world should be taxed. Augustus did issue empire-wide taxation decrees around 3 or 2 BC. Now, a major empire-wide oath of loyalty and taxation enrollment occurred around 3 to 2 BC. This enrollment required local client states conduct their own registration. Now, just a side note, in 6 AD, Judea wasn't a client state. Now, I know I'm talking way too much about taxation than even I want to talk about, but there's some key details to this. If Judea was a client state, was a client kingdom, then local implementation would follow Herod's rules versus Roman rules for taxation and registration. And Herod used ancestral towns for tribal census. This exactly matches Joseph's travel to Bethlehem. So to put that as clear as I can, the 6 AD would not have required travel. These Roman states don't require travel for taxation and registration. But in Herod's time, a client kingdom, Herod would carry out these registrations under his rule using ancestral towns for a tribal census. Thus, a 3 to 2 BC empire-wide taxation with local registration under Herod, requiring Joseph to go to his ancestral town of Bethlehem, perfectly matches Luke. It does not contradict Matthew, and it supports a 3 BC birth. Now, why scholars ignore this, and here's why they shouldn't, because they begin with the assumption Jesus was born in 6 or 5 BC. So this empire-wide taxation happened after the birth according to that model, and that's why they tie it to the consensus in 6 AD, and then they just simply blow off Luke and say, oh, he was wrong because it didn't happen during Christ's birth. But if we use a 3 BC model of Christ being born, this lines up perfectly with an empire-wide consensus and Herod carrying that consensus out under his jurisdiction and requiring people to travel to their ancestral towns for this registration. So to conclude that, Luke describes a taxation in 3 to 2 BC, not not 6 AD. This places Jesus' birth at 3 BC, when Herod was still ruling. Joseph was required to travel, and no contradiction with Matthew. Now, just quickly reviewing the two main nativity timelines. Model A, what most scholars accept, is that 6 to 5 BC. It's the traditional scholar model. Its strengths, it fits traditional acceptance of a 4 BC Herod death and matches Josephus if it's interpreted rigidly. Now, its weaknesses, it requires rejecting or distorting Luke's consensus. It requires rejecting Josephus's event time frame. That's the events that take place between the eclipse and the time Herod dies. It does not match any astronomical events that parallel symbolism that what the Magi could possibly have been interpreting. It gives no time for the Magi to be able to travel, talk to Herod, and visit Jesus. It's very constrained, fitting it all in there before Herod dies. Now, the Jesus being born in 3 BC, this fits Herod dying in 1 BC. It fits Josephus's detailed sequence of events. It fits Luke perfectly when translated correctly. It fits Roman taxation structure. It fits astronomical events. It fits Matthew's timeline. It fits Magi travel time. It fits Jesus being about 30 when he begins his reign. It fits well with the crucifixion dates. Now, its weaknesses, scholars are slow to abandon the 4 BC date when Herod died, and it requires acknowledging that the 4 BC eclipse is inadequate, and instead the 1 BC eclipse was the one that Joseph was referring to before Herod died. So, I know that's a lot, but the 3 BC for Christ being born fits every single line of evidence. And we won't get into this to this video, but there's some astronomical events that are highly symbolic of a king being born in Judea, and also a star that rests over Bethlehem. But these do require a 3 or 2 BC model, whereas a 5 or 6 BC, these events happen far too late. So definitely stay tuned if you want to hear more about that. So based on every anchor available, historical, textual, astronomical, calendrical, linguistic, theological, is Jesus Christ was born in the spring of 3 BC, and that the Magi arrived in late December of 2 BC, and Herod died in 1 BC. Now, given that, now the next question is, who were the Magi? Now, in the Gospels, it says the wise men, but the original translation is Magi. Now, the next video, I'll be talking more about this. Who were these people? Why were they following a star? How could they know about the birth of Christ? And why were they so significant in coming and worshiping him? And what that means. That's going to be in the next video. So if you're not already, go ahead and subscribe. And I look forward to talking to you more about this.